All right, so we're going to walk through the process of creating limited access accounts in AllSight for users or user groups who only need to run reports and look at dashboards. There's all kinds of reasons you might provide access, and a lot of this information is going to apply across the board, but we're going to kind of step through the process with that goal in mind. And then what you'll see is there is a simple way, there's a pretty straightforward way of doing some of these things right out of the box. But like with many things with this software, there are layers and layers of customization and complexity that are possible. And we'll kind of give you a little bit of taste of what some of that looks like, but we're not going to go too far down the rabbit hole in this call. I'll tell you what kind of the limit of what you might try to do on your own might be when we get there. And then beyond that, I would definitely strongly recommend talking to our support department or reach out to me for some assistance with some more deep customization. So while there are many ways to customize settings and fine-tune each user's level of access, it doesn't have to be a roadblock to getting started. So we want to show you it really doesn't have to be difficult. To get somebody in is very easy. You can do some testing and then fine-tune the level of access that they might need as they run into roadblocks or anything that they might need that's beyond the level that you've initially provided. So whether you're creating internal accounts, which is where we'll start today, or using Active Directory or SSO authentication, the process really is pretty simple. As I said, for testing, the easiest thing to do is to start by creating an internal account, assign it roles and permissions, and start there to kind of figure out what you want to do. And then you can set up the SSO authentication and provide that user that level of access. Okay, so let's jump in to the interface. So the first thing we're going to do, first of all, we're operating in 7.9. This is 7.903, which was just released. As long as you're in 7.9, everything we talk about should be the same. In fact, I think 7.9 is when this settings drop down came into play and this accounts page came into the web at all. Prior to that, everything was done in the key configure admin access window, which is now just called accounts, so that they line up. The accounts page and the accounts window in key configure provide the same functionality. We will come back here when we start talking about ACLs, but I'm going to stick to the web interface as much as possible. If you're familiar with key configure, it's the same functionality between the accounts window here and the accounts page here in the web. So the first thing that we want to talk about is internal accounts, or accounts that you create within the tool that are not being created automatically by external authentication. We'll get there next, but especially for testing, even if you don't intend on assigning a built-in or a internal account to an end user, it's a great way to kind of test the role, test the access that you're setting up before you go the next step and assign a group, an Active Directory group, or a user authentication or access based on external authentication. So you'll see there's a lot of accounts. There's a few accounts here. If I scroll down, there's our accounts, roles, and groups on this accounts page. And the main thing to know is accounts, one way or another, need to be assigned both permissions, which generally speaking is done with roles, but also access, which is generally speaking done with groups. So let's start with something very simple. We're just going to create a new account and give it a restricted level of access with the built-in report-only role. I'm going to click the plus icon up here. You can right-click in Key Configure and choose New Account. And let's just call this Bob T. So there's my account name. I'm going to initially assign a password that I'm going to provide to this user. If I'm just doing this for testing, which is the main point here, I wouldn't really need to do that. I'm going to keep it very simple for the sake of this demonstration. And we're going to enable this account. And the next step, once we've got the account name and password set up, is we're going to assign roles and groups. Remember, I mentioned that roles are generally where permissions come from and access is granted with ACLs. The way we typically will describe that is it's kind of like having a driver's license and having the keys to a vehicle. The role permission is like having the driver's license. If I assign the report only role to this account just by dragging and dropping it in, and I save. Well, I've got to confirm that. Okay, so now we've got the report only role in place, and what's listed down here are all the different permissions that a user account can be granted. And this user has now inherited the permissions granted to the report only role. And as we look through, you're going to see view. We're allowed to run reports and see things, but we're not allowed to make changes. We're not allowed to delete things. It's really just running reports and getting data out of the system, inherited by the report only role. Now, if I were to log out right now and log in with this user account, they actually aren't going to be able to do anything. They've got a driver's license, but they don't have the keys to any vehicle. So they might have permission to drive, but they still can't actually access a vehicle and drive away. That is where access control lists come into play. And we're going to go a little bit deeper into that in key configure. But the important thing to know is just out of the box, the simple approach, all you really need to do is assign a user to either the editors group or the viewers group. And as you might guess, in this case, I'm just going to drag and drop the viewers group into the roles and groups section here and save again. And now they have the keys to view various objects within the tool. Couple of caveats here, other things to be aware of. One is the administrator's role and the enterprise manager role are the two top level roles. The only difference between the two is that the enterprise manager doesn't have the ability to make server level changes. I don't think they can grant access to other accounts. I don't think that they have, there's a few things that are top level that only the administrator role can do. But when it comes to the data in the system, looking at computers, deleting computers, looking at software products, adding and removing policies, any of the day-to-day management that has to do with the data and not the server itself, the enterprise manager role is going to be able to do all of those things. What's unique about these two roles is they come with the keys. So they have access to do the things that they have permission to do out of the box. And if you're assigning either of these roles, you don't have to also assign the viewers or editors groups. Other than that, any of the built-in roles, as well as any roles that you create yourself, are going to need to be provided access one way or another. And the easy, most common approach is going to be to assign one of those two groups. Okay. So at this point, this user, we're done. I can log out and log in with this user account and do the things that this user has permission to do. So it really is as simple as that. Now, what you're going to find, though, as you do some testing, is this user isn't going to have exactly the level of permission and access that you want them to have. So if we just kind of take a look through some of these permissions, what we're going to see is you might want them to be able to create report folders so that they can move reports into a folder. You might want this particular user to have any of these other permissions that the out of the box report only role doesn't have. So to keep this fairly simple, usually the best thing to do in that case is going to be to find the role that is the closest to the one that you want and make a duplicate of it. The duplicates will be editable. Any role that you create is editable. Any of that built-in out-of-the-box roles are not. I wasn't sure about this until just now, but it doesn't look like we can create a duplicate here in the web just yet. So I'm going to open up Key Configure and just show you it really is as simple as finding the role you want to duplicate, right-click, and click Duplicate. I'm not going to do this, but it would give me a report-only role copy that would then be editable for me to go in and make changes to. And then if I just dragged and dropped that new role in to the account, I would have those permissions with the changes. So that's, again, how to keep this as simple as possible. Find the role that's the closest to what you're trying to do, and then make a duplicate of it, make whatever modifications you need, save it in key configure, and then when you come back here and refresh the page, you'll see your new role and drag that one into place instead of the other one. One other thing just to be aware of, these are additive. So any permissions granted to any roles that you add here are going to add up. So let's say the report only role, I also wanted to grant a user the ability to check out loaner computers or devices. I could add the loaner checkout role here. Be careful with this because the loaner checkout role has the ability to make changes to computer records. So just that one thing, they're pretty restricted on what they can see. They can only see the loaner checkout tool, but because they're checking the computer out, they've got to be able to add a due date. They've got to be able to make changes to computers. So if I do the report only and the loaner checkout, I'm actually granting, perhaps unintentionally, a lot more permission than I realize, potentially. So do testing. Make sure you're aware if you're not just grabbing one, you're throwing a couple things in here. The account roles are additive. So be careful when you do that. So the next subject then is, okay, well, what about user groups and external authentication? I don't want to create a password and create an internal account and have to manage a separate account for each individual who's logging into the system. I'd like to be able to create a group in Active Directory and assign permission to that group and allow users to authenticate against AD and automatically be granted the permissions that they need. Okay, so to do that, we are going to come to the main settings page into account setup. And in the drop down at the top, you're going to select Active Directory in most cases, but Azure AD will work. There's a LDAP option, but we're not going to get too deep into that today. What we really want to talk about is how do I assign permissions and grant access to AD groups instead of dealing with individual users. So first step is we're going to create the group in Active Directory. And you're going to need separate groups for each level of access. And something we've been talking about here quite a bit in the last couple of days is we've got a limited number of fields here, and there's another limitation back in that other window about dropping external group names in. So everything I'm going to show you is based on just a simple group name, but you could run into limits, in which case you might need to do some nested groups in AD. And I'll try to give examples of what that might be, but we're not going to go too far today. The idea here is I've got a group in Active Directory called Sassafras and another group in Active Directory called Key Server Admins. There's up to 3 groups in AD that I can drop names for here, and then there's drop downs to the right of each of them. What's happening here for this Sassafras group is anyone who's a member of this group, when they successfully authenticate, is going to be assigned to the manager account. This is a built-in account that has administrative level access. The idea is I don't want to have a separate account for each individual user, but I would like this user group to have a shared experience when they log in. Maybe I'm going to create the dashboard and I'm going to lock it down. I'm going to decide what their access is going to be. But when they log in, members of this group should have an entirely shared experience and be part of the same account. So there's 4 built-in accounts that were created with that in mind. And then you can, of course, create accounts like the one we did create earlier, that when a member of this group logs in, they get pushed into this shared account and they get that managed experience at that account level. The only downside to doing it this way is because everyone's logging into the Bob T account or to the manager support account, you won't be able to see exactly who made changes if an account is authorized to make changes or add or remove or delete things. So be aware of that. This is a pretty common approach for things like loaner checkout or the report only role, where you're managing the view. They can't do too much anyway, and it just kind of keeps the interface clean and doesn't create a bunch of accounts as time goes on. The other, probably even more common option here is to create accounts as needed. Exactly as that sounds, what that does is when I successfully authenticate externally, an account is going to automatically be created back on this accounts page for me. And then from there, the level of access and the permissions that I have is going to be determined based on my group. So if I come back and key server admins is listed here, create accounts as needed. If a member of that group logs in, they're going to be granted the level of access that the key server admins group has been granted. So where is that done? That's actually done back where we were. So the administrator's role has an external group field here. And that's where I would also drop that group name if I was setting up access to an Active Directory group. On that account setup page, I would then put that group name and tell it create accounts as needed, but that group also needs to be granted permission and access. As I said before, the administrator role is granted access and permission automatically, both of them. So all I would need to do for the administrator group is to drop in that external AD group name here and save. Now, this is where nesting can come in to play, because you can only drop one group name here. You can't do a comma separated list. You can only drop one group name in. So keep that in mind as you're kind of creating this and setting it up. If you run up against that limit where you've got two separate groups that both need the administrator role or both need one of these other roles, or more importantly, both need one or the other of these groups, you need to do some nesting on the AD side so that you can have a top level group that you drop into, let's say, the viewers group here or the editors group here, and then you could be more specific back on that other page when it comes to creating accounts as needed or assigning users to a specific account. So you can see how there's the simple approach, and then there is a potential rabbit hole of customization, and we haven't even looked at ACLs yet. So I want to come back to key configure and just to put ACLs into context. I want to show you a couple of things. One, just to again kind of give you the full view. If I go into the config menu and I come down to edit server ACL, don't come in here and mess around, but I just want to show you. As I was describing, or as I was explaining, the administrator role and the enterprise manager role are granted keys to the palace at the level of the role itself. So those two roles are unique. There's also an editors group and the viewers group that are granted less access, but granted access, and those can go in addition to any of the other roles to easily provide access to the other accounts. There's a couple of others here. You'll notice key server admins and local admins that are not default. You won't see these in yours. So every once in a while, we'll run into a situation where, okay, you're not necessarily using Active Directory, or you can't do nested groups for some reason. And the alternative to nesting is sometimes to bring one of these other roles right here into the server level ACL. We don't recommend it. You'll see that the system will warn you against doing it. But just as an example, or just to kind of give you an idea of the level of power and customizations that's possible, there is on the key configure side the ability to do make some adjustments to kind of override some default functionality. So that's one thing. The other thing to be aware of when it comes to ACLs is, and this is probably more common than adding things to the root server level ACL, is that each object in the system has its own ACL. And so if you're at the root level, everything at the root level is going to flow down to the individual objects. But it is very possible to take an account, let's say a lab manager account, and give it specific access, the keys to just one lab or just one section. And actually, the section level is more common. Take one more step back. Let's say what you wanted was to create a lab manager account that was only going to have access to a subset of your labs. That's actually what sections are here for. There's a couple of other use cases, but sections make it very, very simple to grant some level of access, whether it's read-only or read-write, to a group of computers without granting total access to everything. And that is that there is a section manager role and a section reporter role. And what will also happen, if I remember correctly, I don't see them here, that's the only reason I hesitate, but I believe when you create a section, the act of right-clicking in this window and creating a new section, giving it a name and saving, will also create a section group. So there would be an east group and a north group in this case here when those got created that have been deleted. So that section allows you to easily restrict users to specific computer groups. Because just like the viewers group and just like the editors group, if you drop an external group name in here, then they're being granted that level of access, but only to the computers in that specific section. So let's just log out, because we got a little bit of time here, and log in with the account. Now, I'm not doing external authentication for Bob because we created that account internally. I'm going to choose direct sign in. I'm going to type in that name that I created, my very secure password, and now I'm in. I've got the default dashboard. Now, I'm still not going to be able to make changes to this dashboard because this account does not have the ability to make changes. It's a report-only role. So if I wanted changes to this user's account, I would have needed to select it. As the administrator, dashboard over here to the right of it has one of these chevrons. You can expand. I could have clicked Bob T's dashboard. It would look just like this. But as the administrator, I could have changed it and kind of updated how it looks. Now I'm in as this account, and you can see I've got a lot fewer options over here, and I can't make changes to anything. There are some built-in reports I'm able to run. I can access the extras. I can access most of the data within the system from a reporting standpoint, from a consumer standpoint, consuming the data, but I can't break things. So we had an interesting conversation yesterday about why we don't simplify some of this. And the reality was that despite my attempts to argue for it, I had to concede at the end of the discussion that, oh, if we simplify it, we're taking away functionality. It really is about as simple as it can be, and without taking functionality back. So it's complex. It can be extremely complex, but we've done some things to make it simple to the extent that your needs are relatively straightforward and simple. But do some testing and reach out with questions.